Hello, everyone. I'm Karen McNeil, author of the Wine Bible and editor of the digital newsletter Wine Speed. And this is episode 1 of our 3-part series, The Champaign Life. Thank you for being here. We're so glad you're here. And this evening, we'll take, of course, all of your questions. And I hope we'll define what the Champaign life means. But I will say, my guest is a woman who I think has perhaps as much as anyone mastered the Champaign life, and that's Blaine Ashley. Blaine, welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you for having me. Absolutely.
Blaine is the founder of New York Champagne Week, which first debuted in 2013. If I was still in New York, I would have gone to every single one of them, I assure you. There is a lot of champagne being poured, I'm sure. So I'm looking forward to our discussion because I know, Blaine, that like me, you've done your best for consumption figures here. Yeah. So, in this episode, we're going to talk about champagne's multisensory appeal. And, we all know that there's flavor and, of course, there's aroma, there's feel, but there's also sight and sound. And I thought we might start there because, if you read a standard tasting note about champagne, you would rarely perhaps see anything about sound in particular. You might see something about tiny bubbles, but I'm wondering if the way champagne sounds and looks is important to you.
Absolutely. It's a huge part of the marketing that goes into Champagne Week. I mean, I'm sure you've seen some of the verbiage we put out there on our social media and in our newsletters. And we use a lot of words like, pop, even though it's not super kosher to actually make the physical sound of the pop. When you're in the industry or a sommelier presenting a wine to a table, you want it to be a slight whisper, if you will, when you open up a bottle of champagne. But, when we use words and sounds to market and promote champagne to the everyday enthusiast, we like to create that kind of excitement around the idea of we're popping off on November 7th and popping bottles and come pop billions of bubbles with us during New York Champagne Week. So the sound of the cork, even though I believe you and I share the same sentiment that it's not just a reserved for celebratory wine. It's very much a serious wine that can be opened every day of the week and paired with any food that you're serving to your guest or just your significant other, creating that excitement and feel around the special aspect of opening and uncorking a bottle of wine, but in this case, popping a bottle of champagne is really, really special. I feel that's kind of my sentiment on the pop or the corking of the wine.
You so rightly point out that, when you do open a bottle of champagne correctly, you're not supposed to make that big thwack, you're supposed to have this fabulous long hiss, right? But either way, there's real, actual hard evidence here that I want all of our viewers to know. And most of that comes from a guy named Charles Spence. I just pulled off my shelf his book called Gastrophysics. If you know this book, Spence is the head of the Cross-Modal Sensory Laboratory at Oxford University. And his essential premise is that what we call flavor, which you think is in your mouth, on your palate, is really in your mind. And one of the principles one of the concepts that Spence has explored in his experiments is this issue of sound. And the two most famous experiments are that potato chips are actually rated as better and more flavorful the more crunch they make. So in focus groups, crunchier potato chips, even with the same flavor, got much higher marks than potato chips that didn't have quite that crunch. And his second really fantastic experiment was to show that people who heard background music of the ocean while they were having a seafood dish rated that seafood dish higher than people who weren't hearing the ocean while they were having their shrimp whatever dish. So we know that sound plays a very big role in the appreciation of a food or of a wine. And for me, it's not just the pop, though. I like the little gentle sound of the bubbles.
Oh, me too. I mean, I always put my ear up to the glass.
Yeah.
And this particular, and we have similar glass. We might have the same glass, but I think we do maybe.
We're going to talk about these glasses.
Okay. But this particular glass is one of my favorites because you can just see the mousse so beautifully the whole entire time I've had this. I will keep a glass of champagne filled for 2 hours and I'm still getting that perlage. It's so beautiful, but also you can hear it. And I love it so much. It's something that I'm constantly talking about when I pour champagne for friends. And I love doing glass comparisons so you can see and hear and smell it, all different sorts of ways, depending on the glassware.
And I believe that even if you and I are both in the business. And so we tend to, really examine every aspect of a wine. But I kind of believe that even if you just went over to someone's house and you were just enjoying the wine, sort of subliminally, all of this multi-sensory aspect is, you're still lodging it, right? You're still recognizing it, even if it's slightly subliminal. Let's talk about sight for a second, because I don't know about you, but as a longtime wine writer, I've kind of trained myself to not think about the color of a wine, to not think about sight too much, because in still wine, color can throw you off, right? You can see a very fragile, frail looking Pinot Noir and think, oh, this isn't going to be very good. And meanwhile, the wine is fantastic, riveting, dramatic. And we know that in still wine, intensity of color is not correlated with intensity of flavor. But in Champagne, you're looking not only at color, you're looking at bubbles. What does that tell you? What do you think about when you're looking at bubbles?
Well, I'm thinking about how long the champagne is aged because generally when I'm looking at a champagne and the finer the bubbles are, the longer the champagne is aged, and the richer the color, the longer champagne is aged. So my brain immediately tends to go there. And I find that to be true, unlike still wine in most cases, that visually champagne really does tell you quite a bit in terms of the aging that it's undergone when you look at the color and the mousse.
Yes, definitely a more deeper yellow color, a more golden color in all white wine is an indication of longer age. And when I first started learning about Champagne all of these many years ago, I was taught that very fine bubbles, sort of as one French winemaker said to me, not Perrier bubbles, but no big, large bubbles, but really tiny bubbles was a sign of long aging on the yeast lees, right? You probably have heard that too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. But I have to say that recently I interviewed a few scientists and several winemakers, at the University of Reims, the main town in Champaign, who say that slightly larger bubbles may be important because aroma is sort of propelled to your nose better by slightly larger bubbles. Now, these are still tiny by kind of other beverage standards. They're still not Perrier sparkling water or cola size bubbles. But it is important, I mean, not only to sort of see those bubbles, but to realize that they're indispensable to the flavor.
Oh, 1000%. But even when a wine has aged, I actually just had the pleasure to taste a 40-year-old champagne this weekend. And it'd been a while since I've had something that's got that much age on it. And the bubbles were beautiful. I mean, you would think that it would be near flat, but they were just stunning. You could still taste them just almost as beautifully as you can in this 2006 I have here, which we'll get to later. But I was really impressed with that the perlage was still quite apparent in a 40-year-old vintage champagne.
Among the many things, right, that Champagne is just like, oh my God, what an incredible wine. Yeah, I think I first understood that bubbles, color, sound has an important psychological effect. As a young journalist in New York so many years ago, I would go to an event and I would watch someone being poured a glass of champagne, and it felt like men just sort of stood up taller. Women just kind of
got more beautiful.
Yes.
What are all the quotes, right? It's like, what makes a woman more beautiful?
I thought, wow, this is pretty interesting, the psychological impact, quite apart from the fact that we know that champagne is in fact a wine. So without any bubbles, without any sound, it can still be evaluated as a beautiful wine just because of its flavor and aroma. Well, let's taste some wines together here as we explore this idea. And we have two really fantastic wines, both of which happen to be grower champagnes, which I'll explain in a moment. The first one is this Champagne NICOLAS MAILLART. And this is a Premier Cru Extra Brut Blanc de Noir. So, there's so many, Champagne has so many different styles. So let me define a couple of things here. First, we know that you could have a champagne from a house. There are about 360 firms, large-ish. Then there are lots of growers, 16,000 growers in Champagne, about 4,000 of whom make their own so-called grower champagne. And then there are just fantastic champagnes also from co-ops, which have been very traditional in the region, 140 or so co-ops. So a champagne could come from anyone, a house, a grower, or a co-op. This happens to be a grower. And MAILLART is pretty interesting because they age many of their wines in old barrels. So no new oak here, but beautiful old, lots of reserve wine. In fact, 30 to 40% reserve wine. And only from Premier Cru and Grand Cru vineyards on the Montagne de Reims, which we should talk a little bit about the topography of Champagne. It is not like Bordeaux, which is essentially flat. It's quite hilly in many parts. And many of the best vineyards are in that so-called solar belt, right in the middle of the slope, where historically many of the best vineyards were. But this wine is all Pinot Noir. What does that, when you see a Blanc de Noir, white, translated as white from blacks, white wine from black grapes, meaning Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and in this case, Pinot Noir dominant, What sort of does that set up for you, Blaine? What are you imagining the wine's going to be like?
Well, you said earlier racy, and that is spot on. I always think, oh, I'm in the mood for 100% Blanc de Noir. I want that racy aspect, a little bit of like, like Pinot Meunier in particular, which is now becoming so much more popular as a dominant grape in Champagne. It's got so much like funk and complexity, and I love seeing those Pinot Meunier dominant wines, but I just think racy, robust in a beautiful way. And mine actually is not. I think we have different wines. I have a Pinot Noir dominant wine, but same 30 to 40% reserve wines. But I have a little bit of Chardonnay and Pinot Meunier in my glass. But yeah, I think race. When I want race, I go for Pinot Noir dominant. When I want elegance, I go for Chardonnay dominant. That's just kind of the vibe I lean toward. So what do you think?
Well, let me describe reserve wines first, because, in the very old days, and we know that Champagne's been made for several centuries at this point, until very recently, because of climate, it was difficult. The Champenois didn't always have a great vintage on their hand because they are such a marginal climate. They're so far northeast of Paris, about 90 miles, and Paris itself is at a pretty high latitude, excuse me. So what did the Champenois do? Quite brilliantly, they began to store and reserve some amount of wine from every year, so that if they had a completely awful year, there would still be wine in the cellar to make a champagne from. So this tradition of keeping back reserve wines, usually some of the best wines from that vintage, has a long, more than a century old history in Champagne. And some wineries use, as MAILLART does, a lot of reserve wines in the blend. So it's just so delicious because it gives the wine, I don't know, a kind of gravitas and depth, which you especially notice in a Pinot Noir dominant wine. So nice.
100%. Yeah.
All right. The other wine that we have, also a grower, is Pierre Moncuy. Let me hold this up for a moment. Pierre Moncuy is this is a Blanc de Blanc. And there are a lot of Blanc de Blancs made in Champagne now. And if you are a Chardonnay lover, if you love elegance and beautiful sort of, I think of it almost as gymnastic lift, and that powdery chalkiness that comes from limestone soils. Champagnes that are Blanc de Blancs are your wine. I confess to really loving them. Blaine, what do you think?
I mean, I go back and forth, but this particular wine, first of all, the producer Pierre Moncuy was one of the first that I was exposed to when I started working in Champagne. So it's near and dear to my heart. Also, it's extremely hard to get your hands on right now in New York. It's allocated. So there is a true champagne shortage going on at the moment. That's no lie. But this particular Chardonnay or Blanc de Blanc is fantastic. I right when I gave it a whiff, I got a nice like lemon kind of cream puff aspect to it. And then when I tasted it, I really got that age on there. It kind of almost came off as an Oloroso to me in a way, some caramel and sherry. I just think this is a stunning, stunning wine. I love it so much. So I'm happy to taste it today. I feel so lucky. And that 2006, again, it's a millésime. So you've got at least 85% of the vintage year in this glass, which is fantastic. Super special.
Let me address some of the great comments we have coming in on the chat. June Jacob says that Gerard Ligier Belair wrote the whole, the whole book on bubbles, and right he is the leading scientist on bubbles. And the person who, as far as I know, for the new wine Bible, I checked with him several times. Is it really true that one glass of champagne has the potential for 1 million bubbles? Yes, according to Ligier Belair, and he's the man. And Andrea is saying, can you name the book again that you mentioned in the beginning, please? It's quite fascinating. It's called Gastrophysics by a man named Charles Spence. And I don't know if he talks about champagne in this book, but he certainly talks about beverages and our, in a sense, psychological response to beverages. And who is the maker? June is asking again, who is the maker of the glass that I'm drinking from? And our glasses look very similar. Mine is my own glass. It's called the Flavor First Collection. And this glass is the Fresh and Crisp glass. And we drink rosé from it, Sauvignon Blanc from it, Pinot Grigio from it, and of course, champagne from it. But your glass, Blaine, is similar, but slightly different.
So it is Philippe Chamez designed it, renowned sommelier from Le Crayere, and it was his collection that he did with Lehman glassware, and it's the perfect champagne glass is what it was dubbed. And we actually used them in 2016 at New York Champaign Week throughout the week. So it was really special. Comes in a beautiful tin. I think it's not continued anymore, but I'm very happy to have a few in my collection. And I'll have to now get yours too, because it looks like a beautiful glass. Can I not?
I want to promise you one thing, my friend, which is this glass is $10 and your glass is probably $50.
It's probably a lot more. And the other glasses I have here, which I swapped them out, are the Gabriel glass gold standard, and that's an $80 glass. So that's insane. But these I also drink still wine out of these glasses quite often. To your point, it's a perfect shape for it. But yes, I will definitely buy some of yours. Please send me the link.
But you know, the reason that both of us love this shape, I think the larger important point here is that champagne is a wine, and it's not just a bubbly wine, it's a wine. And because it's a wine, it opens up with air. And I remember when I first started drinking champagne, you know, really tall, sexy flutes. And I thought, ooh, this is so sleek and so great. But they were terrible for champagne because you couldn't swirl the wine. And because you couldn't swirl it, you couldn't really smell it. And I'm so happy that so many restaurants, so many sommeliers are going to these wider shapes now and not filling the glass all the way full, in recognition of the fact that, you know, when you're tasting under the bubbles, in a sense, you're tasting the beauty of that Pinot Noir, that Chardonnay, that Pinot Meunier, grown in one of the most treasured terroirs in the world. So you want to smell it, right? You want to swirl it. So these types of glasses allow you to do that.
Right. And when I started Champagne Week, you know, it wasn't being treated as serious of a wine, quite honestly. And the flutes were still alive and kicking in New York. You know, people I feel like started, at least restaurants that had great champagne programs, started to integrate at least the all-purpose glass or a glass of this shape into their programs. It's interesting though, how it still hasn't trickled down very much to the, I don't like to say consumer, the wine enthusiast or champagne enthusiast. It really hasn't even penetrated that group quite yet, unless they truly order champagne once a week or very often. People are still very much, you know, drinking out of flutes. But if they come to an event of mine or someone else's, you'll never see a flute at an event like that.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's hard to change established behavior patterns. And God knows, before I started drinking champagne out of a more rounded glass, I'm pretty sure I drank some pretty fantastic champagnes out of flutes
I
too.
know.
I don't want anyone to feel bad if they're, if they're using a flute.
Again, it's all subjective and whatever makes you feel happy. But this one, the 2006 we have here, I would pour this in a Burgundy glass,
Mm.
full on Chardonnay driven type of glassware shape. So I think it'd be beautiful.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Question here, because you hang out in New York with lots of somms and people who really know their wine and know their champagnes. But I wonder if someone just kind of walked up to you and said, I understand that you know a lot about champagne. I don't know very much. Like, where do I start? Meaning, how do I buy a champagne? What would you say?
I always say to speak to the wine representative at your store because they oftentimes have so many stories about every single wine on their shelf, and they really want to be able to tell the customer about the wines. We have such knowledgeable staff members at every single wine store. And I feel like if you just go up to someone and you say, I've heard about grower champagnes and I'm really interested, can you tell me where to find a good one or a few to try? It comes with education. So people want to be educated these days. I will say, as much as I said that the flute concept hasn't quite trickled down to the consumer is a lot smarter. They're more conscious of what they're drinking, where they're drinking, where it's from, who made it, the story behind the wine, and same goes for food. I think a lot of people are becoming more interested in where is this from, right? When you're like a little kid, you're like, where did this come from? And now people are a lot more interested in that story, and the story really sells the wine, and like we have this 9th generation made champagne. That's interesting to the consumer. So I think that it's about, I would just say, go and speak to your local wine store and ask them what they're excited about.
And I have to jump in and challenge you a bit on that, because if you're in New York, as you are, yes, you can do that. Fabulous retail stores, really knowledgeable people. If you're in California, you might be buying wine at Costco. You might be buying wine over the internet. There aren't quite as many sort of well-staffed brick and mortar shops. Right. Although there are some, and we here in the Napa Valley, I mean, we have a wonderful Gary's, for example, and Gary is fantastically knowledgeable about Champagne. But I guess what I would say, to answer my own question, sorry, is, jump in the pool anywhere, right? It's a big pool. There's lots of good stuff happening, but jump in anywhere. Because I think the behavior of just buying champagne, getting used to it being just such a delicious way of demarcating day from night. I'll admit, by the way, that in our office, we are awful about this. 5 o'clock, we're like, okay, what champagne are we drinking? I mean, of course, everybody works beyond 5 o'clock. So I don't know, we joke about this, but the side benefit of working with me is, all right, it's 5 o'clock. Everybody can work with a glass of champagne for another hour. But just dive in anywhere.
I love that. Yeah, no, I agree too. And, one thing in exploring still wine, this is about champagne, but one thing I like to do is I get hooked on regions. So it's like, I'm like, okay, I'm going to try everything from Sicily for like a month and just go nuts on Sicily. And that's another way to do it too, with champagne. But we are spoiled in New York, to your point. And we do have all these great wine stores with educated staff, and everyone's kind of learning and looking to get the next level of their wine education. We also have places like Cork Buzz that from the beginning in 2012, you have Master Sommelier Laura Meniak, who was one of the first, if not the first, youngest female sommelier, who created an approachable wine bar with a champagne campaign. And I mean, she was the originator of that concept. And that's a really cool place to be, to have someone who's such an expert at the age, deemed a master at 32, and went on to create this approachable, fun wine bar that's no pretenses, that kind of removes, you know, the stodginess of a champagne.
Yeah, although wouldn't you agree that I think people have gotten a lot more relaxed about champagne.
Yes.
When I really, I mean, as a young journalist, I felt a little intimidated by even being around people who knew a lot about champagne. But I think that's a lot of that's gone now, thank God.
When I started New York Champagne Week in 2013, I was doing like bubbles and burgers, and people were like, what is she doing? Like now it's like, you know, chips and popcorn and fried chicken and burgers. It's all, you know, accepted. But when I started, people were blasphemy. What is she doing with making champagne so cash, if you will?
Yeah. Well, I'm never giving up personally on potato chips and champagne after a long day at work, coming home, just a couple of really good potato chips and champagne. Yeah, I
have some out right now, some truffle potato chips.
Can't wait to
dive in later.
That's one-upping me. I think I've got like ridges or something. No. But the champagne is good. So let's talk about for a second extra brut and dryness levels, because champagne has been getting drier and drier and drier. Brut champagne 1.2, about 1.2 percent sugar. Was a standard maybe 20 years ago. And now I think the standard dosage is more like 0.7 or 0.9. And extra brut, which we have here, both of these wines, is less than 0.6 grams per liter residual sugar. If not residual sugar. If you're listening and you're like, oh, grams per liter, oh, wait a minute. Let me just say that a standard cola would be about 120 grams per liter residual sugar. I keep wanting to say residual, but it's just straight sugar. So cola, 120 grams per liter sugar. So 6 grams is really dry, and both of these wines are super dry. What do you attribute all of that movement toward more and more and more dry champagnes to?
I think that, again, I mean, I don't know if it was conscious, but I do know that the customer is becoming more and more health conscious, and conscious of where their food and wine and the things they consume come from. I think that has something to do with it, but I also feel like, you know, if you take it back to when champagne was first discovered, it was so sweet. And it was in those like Coca-Cola ranges of the grams of sugar. And it's the sugar or dosage has lessened and lessened and lessened over time. I think also it's a lot more food friendly when it's in the brut or extra brut category. And it truly then becomes a wine that you can have with almost every single thing you can imagine. I mean, champagne to me is the most food-friendly wine that exists. I think there's a champagne for absolutely everything that you could have at your dinner table or at your party or a cocktail party. So that has a lot to do with it too. There was definitely a huge Brut Nature and extra brut champagne movement in New York City. I don't know if it trickled to the rest of the US, but it was definitely like the champagne to drink under 6 gram dosage. And we have, as you said, the 6 gram the Pierre Moncuis, and then the 4 gram dosage Nicolas MAILLART. So yeah, I think it has a lot to do with both of those things, just trend and going down in sugar levels just through the years, and then also the customer becoming more conscious. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I think it has to do with the fact that vineyards in Champagne have been really doted on in the last 20 years, really taken care of as, not that they weren't before, but viticultural science has moved forward tremendously. And we know a bit more about how to get really physiologically ripe grapes, even in very cool climates. And once you have really ripe grapes, you don't need, in the end, very much sugar to do anything else. The wines are already pretty inherently balanced. In really old days, a lot of the base wines in Champagne were so high in acidity that you really needed, it was like having a super bitter espresso. You had to put a teaspoon of sugar in it to make it balanced. Now that that the grapes are coming in pretty balanced on their own by virtue of better viticulture around the world, there's less need to have a corresponding amount of sugar to balance the acidity in Champagne. And I have to say, speaking for myself, I'm a total acid freak. I love acidity.
Yeah.
I want that, vibrant hit of energy from wine. So have a little.
I was like, was that me? I was
that was not you. I think that was my little office dog here deciding to run out. He's heard the Champagne talk before, I guess. But let's go back to food for a second, because when you said, and by the way, I'm with you, how much you love Champagne with different styles of food and could have it throughout a meal. What is it, though, that Champagne has that is it just your love of it, or you think there's actually some structural component of Champagne that
I think that the acidity plays a lot into that, and being able to stand up to a lot of different types of foods, but also the alcohol content. It's a much lower than a still wine, particularly a red wine, which can dominate a lot of flavors and food and kind of leave you on your laurels in terms of being done with all the food and wine you've consumed for the night. Champagne is something that I can drink all night and still feel pretty good at the end of the night. Even if I've had a rich meal, the digestive aspect of the wine really helps a lot, I think, and the low alcohol content for sure.
Yeah.
Acid's a good thing.
Acid is a good thing. Karen was just asking, is it all viticulture, or does a warmer climate in Champagne also have an impact on ripening of the grapes? And yes, of course, Karen, you're right to point that out, because a warmer climate in northern regions like Champagne has allowed more dependable ripening every year. You're still in a cool place relative to other wine regions around the world, but there's no doubt that a slightly in some places and more than slightly in others, warming climate has allowed the Champenoise to feel that ripeness is now a dependable issue. Of course, we're not going to tackle right now climate chaos, which is the other side of the coin and very worrisome, because climate change doesn't just mean climate warming. It also means frosts and hail and rainstorms and fires in California and a million other things that are not good outcomes of climate change. But yes, grapes are more dependably ripe in Champagne. And in fact, the harvest is earlier. It's, I believe, about 20 days earlier than it was even just 10 years ago. I do want to say, Guyane, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, just wrote in to say, I buy my Champagne with memories and stories in mind. I had, as Blaine mentioned, excuse me, I had Veuve Clicquot because it's the first one I shared with my husband of 38 years. And Nicolas Foyat I had because it's my son's first name, and I opened a bottle at his birth and his special birthdays, including his wedding, and his children's birth have all been celebrated with Nicolas Foyat. There you go.
That makes me happy to hear, because Nicolas Foyat is a negociant, but they supply a lot. They're the largest negociant, if I'm not mistaken, or they used to be, and they supply a ton of work for the farmers / growers in Champaign, and encourage them to go out on their own to do their own projects. So they are one of the kind of like Mother Teresa brands out there, or Mr. Nicola brand. They do a lot for the category and for the region for sure. So that's nice to hear.
Absolutely. Well, Blaine, it's been just really wonderful to talk with you. I'm getting very excited because as we go into the fall, a lot of people who may be in the spring and summer are like, I don't think I can go there yet. I think in fall, sort of the doors of wine kind of burst wide open, and people begin to drink more champagne on a regular basis. And as you and I know, that's part of a good life. So thank you so much.
I feel like I'm going to move in with you though in your office, because you're having champagne every day. I'm not even having champagne every day.
Some woman has to do it, my friend. I don't know. No, we are. We're pretty committed around this place.
I love that.
Yeah,
you guys have a great champagne culture in Napa. It's one of the best. I always, you've got. I feel like people in Napa actually drink more champagne regularly than they do in New York.
I will tell you that our local grocery store, where you can see any number of Napa Valley winemakers in the aisles every night, has a big champagne section, and it's all cooled and ready to go. Oh yes, we're doing our part here in the small little Napa Valley.
I love that.
Thank you so much for joining me, Blaine. It's been really fun.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to hopefully seeing you at New York Champagne Week and getting a signed copy of your book, ordering some of your glassware, all the things.
Thank you. Well, we will all make that happen. So thank you. And thank all of you for joining us tonight. We hope that we've inspired you a little bit to have a champagne life too. I'm sure many of you already do. So a toast to everyone. Thank you. And we'll see you on episode 2.
Santé.
Santé.